Hello everyone. Today I'll be presenting on the topic probability and non-probability sampling. So the objective for this presentation are going to be learning the meaning, the definition, probability sampling, non-probability sampling, combination of probability and non-probability sampling, and the last one we have the conclusion. First, I'd like to talk about sampling. As we know, a sample is a smaller representation of a larger population to determine truths about the population. Why do we sample? Because, number one, we have lack of resources, which may be time, money or workload implication, and busy schedule. A sample also gives results with non-accuracy that can be calculated through different statistical means. The essential characteristics of sampling is that one can specify for each element of the population the chance of being included in the sample. Each element has the same probability of being included, but that is not necessary condition. And here is a definition given by Webster. The act, the process, or technique of selecting a representative part of a population for the purpose of determining parameters or characteristics of the whole population. And this is a visual that I like to use where you think about the target population is the whole group and the study population is a smaller representation of that group that hopefully you can generalize to, and a sample is going to be a component of that study population. And the next one we will talk about probability sampling. Probability sampling specifies the chances that sample statistics do not differ more than a certain limit from the population parameters. They may also ensure that enough elements are selected from each stratum of the population. And the major types of probability sampling include simple random sampling, stratified random sampling, and clustered sampling. First, we have simple random sampling. Simple random sampling is a process that gives each element in the population an equal chance of being included in a sample. The elements are selected using a list of random numbers appended with most textbooks of research and statistics. The table is marked at some point and the cases whose numbers are taken into the sample until the desired number of elements is obtained. The selection of any given element places no limits on other element being selected, thus making equally possible the selection of any one of the many possible combinations of the elements. The next one we have proportionate stratified random sampling. In stratified random sampling, population is first divided into each strata. The strata may be based on a single criteria or on a combination of two or more criteria, which is taken from each stratum, and the subsamples are joined to form the total sample. After having determined the sample size from each subcategory, the researcher uses simple random sampling for drawing the desired number of each element for each category. The next one we have this proportionate stratified random sampling. This sampling is almost similar to proportionate stratified random sampling, except that the subsamples are not necessarily distributed according to the proportionate weight in the population from which they were drawn. It is possible that some subsamples are overrepresented while other subgroups are underrepresented. And the last one, we have clustered sampling. In clustered sampling, first of all, the whole research area is divided into sub-areas, more commonly known as cluster. The simple random or stratified method is being used to select cluster. Finally, the researcher arrives at the ultimate sample size to be studied by selecting sample or stratified random sampling basis. The procedure moves through a series of stages, hence common term multi-stage sampling, from more inclusive to less inclusive sampling units until they finally arrive at the population elements that constitute the desired sampling. And the next one, we have non-probability sampling. In non-probability sampling, there is no way of estimating the probability that each element has of being included in the sample, and no assurance that every element has been chance of being included. We will discuss the 4 important types of non-probability sampling that are accidental sampling, quota sampling, snowball sampling, and purposive sampling. The first one we will talk about, accidental sampling. Accidental sampling refers to a method of selecting respondents who happen to meet the researcher are willing to be interviewed. Thus, a researcher may take the first 100 people he meets who are willing. The samples so collected are biased, and there is no known way of evaluating the biases introduced in such sample. And the next one, we have quota sampling. Quota sampling ensures inclusion of diverse elements of the population in the sample. The critical requirement in quota sampling is not that the various population strata be sampled in their correct proportion, but rather that there should be enough cases from each stratum to make possible an estimate of the population stratum value. However, it is more or less similar to the earlier described accidental sampling procedure, except that it ensures the inclusion of diverse elements of the population. And the third, we have purposive sampling. Here, purposive sampling is based on the presumption that with good judgment, one can select the sample units that are satisfactory in relation to one's requirement. A common strategy of these sampling techniques is to select cases that are judged to be typical of the population in which one is interested, assuming that errors of judgment in the selection will tend to be counterbalance each other. And the last one, we have snowball sampling. Snowball sampling is externally helpful in studying some special sampling situation, like getting a sample of drugs abuser or alcoholics or pickpockets. Here we start with a few respondents of the type we wish to include in our study, and who in turn are expected to guide us to get more respondents, and so on. Simple increases in each size as we continue to get more units of study. It is useful in the investigation of sensitive topics mentioned above because the sampling technique depends on sampled cases having knowledge on other similar cases. Another argument in favor of using this sampling technique is that the victims might be hesitant to identify themselves if approached by a stranger, but it but might be friendly to someone who they know and share their experiences or divine status. Let's talk about the combination of probability and non-probability sampling. If sampling is carried out in a series stages, it is of course possible to combine probability and non-probability sampling in one design. That is, one or more of the stages can be carried out according to probability sampling principles and the balance by non-probability sampling. The investigator may select clusters by probability cluster sampling techniques, but at the final stage may select the elements as a quarter sample. Thus, it is possible to select a probability sample of district in a state. Within each of these districts, a probability sample of towns, and within each of the selected towns, quarter sample controlled for age and sex. The advantage of such design is the cost of obtaining cases for the sample. It is relatively inexpensive to select the areas within the final stage of sampling will take place by probability sampling, and we thereby gain the advantage of probability sampling, at least for the areas. There are some evidence, for instance, that quarter samples built up in selected areas are more successful in controlling such variables as socio-economic status than quarter samples, in which the control of these variables depends on the judgments of the interviewers. In conclusion, social work researchers do not generally engage in sampling process like those used for conventional research process. Yet the process of sampling is social work practice is based on principles of sampling discussed in this chapter. In social work practice, most of the time, it is unlikely that we use probability sampling, irrespective of whether one's clients are mentally challenged children, delinquent children, street children, abused children, or drug addicts. We have no way of knowing whether all people with such characteristics had a chance to be in the sample. That much we are most likely to deal with non-probability ability samples with its limitation. Most often, we have people who have happened to come to our agency to have our services. As such, social work researchers have to be careful while making generalization about the findings. Nevertheless, there is no reason to despair. One simply has to keep in mind the limitation of non-probability samples and exercise care in generating the sample. These are the references for my presentation. That's all for my presentation. Thank you all.